Good afternoon, everyone. We have the Die Hard group for the last session of the afternoon. Hooray! I'm Adam Nelson. I'm a professor in educational policy studies and history here at Wisconsin. And thanks for sticking around for the last part of the day's events. We'll have dinner and then another event in the evening. But I'm delighted to welcome our guest, Vinovskis from the University of Michigan, here today. And I just want to say a few words before I turn the mic over to him. Maris actually began his career here at Wisconsin, and we've been missing him ever since for quite a while now. He's now at Michigan, where he is Bentley Professor of History, the Institute for Social Research Professor, and Professor in the Ford School of Public Policy. He's published 10 books, edited 7, and has dozens and dozens and dozens of research articles. Among his books, sort of one of the early big ones, published by the University of Wisconsin Press, was The Origins of Public High Schools. Followed up with History and Educational Policy Making, published by Yale in 1999, Revitalizing Federal Education Research with Michigan in 2001, The Birth of Head Start with the University of Chicago in 2005, and one that will guide, I'm sure, some of his remarks today, From a Nation at Risk to No Child Left Behind, with Teachers College Press in 2009. In addition to this, he has an extraordinary record of public service in government, in the federal government. He was the Deputy Staff Director for the U.S. House Select Committee on Population in the late 1970s, and a consultant on population issues for the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare in the 1980s. He worked in the U.S. Department of Education under both George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton on questions of educational research and policy. And he was a member of the congressionally mandated independent review panel for Goals 2000 and No Child Left Behind. He's a Guggenheim Fellow. He's a Fellow of the National Academy of Education, the International Academy of Education, and past president of the History of Education Society. But his most important honor of all is that he and I share the distinction of being proud graduates of Central High School in Omaha, Nebraska.
And your mascot was?
And our mascot was the Eagles. Go Eagles. So Maris's talk will bring us into the history of federal education policy making and the history of education since World War II. And it'll give us an opportunity, more than other talks that we've had today, to think about the federal role, to think about education policy making from that federal or national perspective. A Nation at Risk was, of course, a federal report, and it marked a key moment, somewhat ironically, in the expansion of the federal role in American education. Even as Reagan wanted to abolish the U.S. Department of Education, dial back the federal role in schools by block granting Title I, if he had had his way, devolving oversight to the states on many programs. A Nation at Risk, put out by the Commission on Excellence under the supervision of Reagan's Secretary of Education, Terrell Bell, put a new federal stamp on what education policy making should be about, emphasizing standards and accountability in a way that we know very well today. So when Maris's book, From a Nation at Risk to No Child Left Behind, came out, I had the opportunity to look at it and then be part of a panel on this book at the Social Science History Association, and here are just a couple things that I said about it then. I said that this book was the most careful, the most compelling, and certainly the most comprehensive inside the Beltway account of the chronology that brought us from Reagan to the present. And along the way, I said, this book frames the abiding paradox of federal education policy. On the one hand, an ever-expanding federal role in the nation's schools since Nation at Risk, but on the other hand, amazingly little measurable progress to show for the billions that have been spent ostensibly to reform the nation's schools with a vision toward equity. So with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Vinovskis.
that was a very generous introduction and a very nice one. And I hope you know that Central has won its 4th consecutive basketball state championship this year. So those are the things that are important to us. It really is nice being back in Madison. This is where I started my academic career. And this is where I began my work in education. I work on a lot of different topics. And while I was here, I worked with my colleague in the history department and who was here in the ed school, Carl Kasel. And Carl was really, and is, really one of the finest historians that has been produced. And he's had a big impact not only on the profession, but many people here, as you know, have had a very important experience with him. My career has been really split between academia, where I've been all the time, and doing work on a variety of sort of social history, family history, demographic, quantitative behavioral studies, and a hobby which I started out early in life trying to save the world in a modest way, certainly compared to my other compatriots in the 1960s. But this hobby over time has sort of become another career, or maybe my career. And that is looking at educational policy. And one of the things that I've enjoyed about doing that, because I've always been wondering, as you have, is how can an academic have an impact beyond his colleagues, which wasn't that satisfying. And it was by happenstance, I ended up working a lot in Washington. And I spent a lot of time working in different administrations, and both for Republicans and Democrats. And that is really fascinating to me and interesting because, for example, I worked for Diane Ravitch in the first Bush administration and loved working for her and worked on the quality of educational research produced by labs and centers. And then the next morning, she's gone because of the election, and a Democratic replacement comes in, and it's interesting to watch how the staff adjust to these changes. Usually we don't get to see that. But it also tells you a lot about how to impact Washington, if it can be impacted. And in some ways, it's also very discouraging when you look from the past. As Michael pointed out, it's not a good predictor of the future, I hope. But it does give us insights, and it is actually very useful, both in writing of the histories and of past policies, but also in working on them, because you have access to a lot of information that can be very helpful in that process. So this afternoon, I'm going to look really at 5 things. First of all, I'll provide an overview of the overall U.S. educational development since World War II. Sometimes it's good just to step back and say, well, where have we gone the last 70 years? You know, where did we come from? We tend to look in a very immediate sense. In Washington, if they can remember something from 2 years ago, they're called historians. But I think we can do better here. Then I'll discuss the evolution of early childhood education and the creation of Head Start in the mid-1960s. This is one of the most popular programs, one of the most well-publicized programs, and maybe not that well understood from a historical context. Third, I will analyze the passage and development of ESEA, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. All of us here probably have heard about it, and we'll talk a little bit about its successes and its problems. And then I'm going to assess federal support and leadership in education, research, and development. So one of the big questions in all of this is, we keep saying, well, we really don't know what to do, but we know we got to do something. We've been spending lots of years and money in both Democratic and Republican administrations on research. Are they hiding it from us? Are they hiding it because they don't want anybody to see what we've produced as university people? So we'll talk about that. And I'll finally conclude with an assessment of federal K-12 activity since World War II, with some speculations about what's going on today, and we'll leave some of that for the question and answer period. But looking at a nation at risk, as you so aptly said, it is very important But it also, you have to realize, a lot was at risk much earlier. They didn't discover it. And once it became something to celebrate every 10 years now, which is very convenient, but people actually don't take a look and say, look, well, what have we done in this 10 years, this 20 years, this 30 years? Or when you do the 40th anniversary in 10 more years. All right, so let's take a look at changes in American society since World War II. The population of the United States has doubled. America became more diverse ethnically, and we increasingly lived in urban areas. So America today is very different, and it's going to be very different in the future as we develop. Since 1945, Americans are much more affluent than we were then, and a smaller portion of the population lives in low-income housing. Now, we've had a tremendous recession, which we may not be over yet. But again, when you take that broader historical view, it's a major, major change. And different parts of the population are getting access that didn't have it today. And still today, at least 1/5 of the population in terms of children live in households below the poverty level. So we've done better than we were in 1945, but we have a long way to go. And we need to think about how we're going to do it and why we're still in this predicament. Some of it's demographics, some of it's economic. And we still have large differences in family income by race and ethnicity. Now, children now attend educational institutions at much younger ages and remain in school longer. So sometimes you just don't realize how much we've changed. The percentage of 5- and 6-year-olds in school, for example, rose from 60% in 1945 to almost 95, 96% today. That's a major change. And I'm not sure we pay enough attention to what we do with children, for example, in kindergartens, which have changed a lot in this period of time. We're so focused on early childhood education. With the creation of Head Start and the expansion of nursery schools and kindergartens, the percentage of 3- to 5-year-olds has doubled from 27% in 1965 to 63% now. So we are really putting a lot of investment of time and energy in early childhood education. And one of the questions we're going to ask today is, are we getting our money's worth, and are children really benefiting that much or as much as we want them to? This is a very important part. Sometimes people in schools of education don't look at the early childhood education because it's an HHS or for some other reason, but it really is a very fundamental part of the story. But also the percentage of older children ages 14 to 17 has increased greatly going to school. But the problem is that the growth in post-war high school enrollments still leaves behind a lot of people who don't graduate. Or they get GEDs, which are not equivalent. We say they're equivalent, but when you get to issues, for example, of employment, when I think about the work we did in Washington with adolescent pregnancy and trying to help young mothers and their children, we pushed them into GED programs. In retrospect, I wonder if that was the right policy. And the high school dropout rate between white and black youth has diminished to some degree, but both blacks and whites are trailed by Hispanics now in high school. So we have a long way to go there. Well, you might say, well, gee, we're doing all of these things. We must be spreading ourselves thin. In real dollars, we probably aren't spending enough money because how can you do all this extra work? But actually, we're spending a lot of money on education more than in the past. On K through 12 education, in constant 2010 dollars, total federal, state, and local expenditures per person rose from by more than 150%, from $1,700 in 1945 to $4,200 in 1965. So you say, wow, there must be something interesting, because if you went for that much more money, And people say, well, that's what we need to do today. We need more money, and I'm sure we need more money. And since 65, in those 4 decades, per pupil expenditures have doubled again. So we need to think about what we're doing with that money and how we can do it better, because as I think I'm going to suggest is, I'm not sure we're going to see much more money. Okay, primary support for public elementary and secondary schools in 1945 basically came from local revenues, 2/3, and from state assistance, about 1/3. About 1% came from elementary and secondary, for elementary and secondary education came from the federal government, but very low. So education for most of our period of time has been a local funded activity and a state funded one as well. In 2008, the relative share of federal contribution rose to 8%, state increased to 48%, and local aid diminished to 44%. Now, the important thing is, almost always, now the recent stimulus plan is very unusual, but other than that, 90% of monies for schooling have come from local or state coffers. So one of the questions we need to ask ourselves, what have we done as citizens of a state? That's where the money's coming from. That's where the money's being spent. So what have we done? So before we yell and scream at the federal government, which is what I'm going to do, we better ask ourselves, what has the state of Wisconsin done for these? What about Michigan? Detroit happens to be in Michigan. How did we tolerate what we have in that sense? Now, with the increasing number of school children, you need a larger supply of teachers. It's one of the most expensive and one of the absolutely most important facets of education. But again, you say here, well, teacher salaries are going down. And again, in this recession, they are. But in constant 2010 dollars, they rose from $37,000 in 1960 to $50,000 in 2008. So it's not like working on Wall Street, and some of us are still trying, but that's not that bad. And it's certainly more than we've had before. And in the 60s, in some ways, we had better qualified people teaching. And we'll come back to that. The total number of public school teachers tripled from 45 to 2008. And one of the things that it permitted was a reduction in student-to-teacher ratios. And reductions are important, potentially, particularly in the early grades and particularly for disadvantaged kids. On the other hand, critics, which I think we have to address, are saying it has made no difference really overall, with few exceptions, on learning of students. So what if we use that money differently? What if we said we're going to concentrate money particularly on the disadvantaged and the early grades and accept a higher level of teacher-student ratios in terms of dealing with the money problems that we're going to have? Again, that to me is one obvious example that we need to look at. I'm not saying we should do it, but we have to have a new way of thinking about things that we think have been settled forever. Now, in 1945, most teachers by then had to have new teachers had to have a college education and teaching certificate. That's a big change since earlier. So our teachers are actually better educated. They have to have a college degree. They have to have a teaching certificate. And today, about 50% of them have a higher degree, usually a master's in teaching. But again, critics now point out it's not really changing their effectiveness with students. Is it the right thing to do to invest in that as opposed to, say, early childhood education, as opposed to funneling more money for grants to students or college students? All of these things, I think, are up for grabs today because we are going to be short, and we are short, of money. Since 1945, the global economy has changed. In 1945, the United States was in an unusually good position. We had succeeded in winning the war with the help of other allies, but World War II devastated Europe and Asia. And during the 1950s and 60s, many of our allies were rebuilding, sometimes with our help. And now they have rebuilt. And now they are back to their competitive positions before the war. And now we're faced with the situation is we can't keep on just surviving. We really have to compete with them successfully, and our educational system has to be able to do it. Everyone in the world recognizes that high-quality jobs, both domestically and abroad, require a well-educated labor force. And having a high school degree, particularly just a GED, just isn't enough, let alone the people who are dropping out. So education becomes more important because the economy and the competition is changing. So not surprising, the federal role is adjusting to a lot of these changes. There are lots of things going on, and the federal role has adjusted to them in some ways. It hasn't been so much the money coming from the federal government. That's been actually pretty modest up to now, but with more regulations. The federal government says, look, every American is a citizen, needs to have equal opportunities, whether they're in Wisconsin or Michigan or Alabama or anywhere. And we think, as experts, or as politicians put it, we have a responsibility. And the question is, how well have those edicts, particularly as we get to America 2000, Goals 2000, and No Child Left Behind, how much has that kind of a federal intervention helped us or not? Now, in the 1970s, the federal and state governments also became more involved in measuring student achievement. And we can raise serious questions about how to measure it and what to do about it. But a big change has come, which is also reinforced by a nation at risk, that all students now need to know things, and we need some way to assess how much they know across grades and across the country. And we've developed things like NAEP and other measures as well. What we do with those standards then is usually the biggest part of the equation. Now, measuring achievement trends over time is very difficult, and people have done a lot of work on it. Overall, it appears to me that generally American student achievement has been relatively stable. We have fought for many years about, did people at the time of World War II, did they know as much as we do today? It seems pretty stable from what we've seen. The problem is, the world has changed. What was good enough then is not good enough now. And so again, the bar is being raised by other people's competition and just the normal development of the world. There are large achievement gaps still between minority and white students, and we've heard a lot about that this morning and this afternoon. But there are also big economic class differences. One of the things that you see now more and more, people are paying attention to these class differences, which are getting larger and have profound effect upon one's life chances. And I'm not so sure we're that interested, quite frankly, at the state or national levels in trying to deal with that problem. Now, in international comparisons, all the programs, America 2000, Goals 2000, and No Child Left Behind, proudly said, in a decade, we will be #1 in science, and they said, we're going to do all of these things. We haven't done any of them. And one of the questions you have to ask yourself is, why should you believe anybody in Washington who says we're going to be #1? I mean, I can see in basketball, but they said Michigan's chances are 2%. Most others aren't good, except for Louisville. But we keep repeating this. We're mediocre among developed countries. We're in the middle range. How do you get away with promising to be #1 asking to be held accountable, never reaching it, and then the news media forget to mention it. So this is, again, a problem we have. We really need to have an honest look at ourselves and what we do. But when you look at education, it's not just education that the federal government is involved in. They make other laws. For example, immigration laws. Immigrants have played a very key role in this country. As being somebody who came to this country at age 6, I'm deeply appreciative of having the opportunity to be here. But net immigration to the United States in the 2 decades after World War II was very small. They had really kept that down. The important date is 1965 with the passage of the immigration law, and the proportion of foreign-born has been steadily rising, 13, 14%. We're back to where we were in the late 1890s, early 20th century, and that means we have a population that's coming in, which is absolutely vital to our survival. We could not do without immigrants because of the population situation, the low birth rate. Today, increasingly the new immigrants, both legal and illegal, are Hispanic, mainly from Mexico. Many of the recent immigrants are, as always, poor, relatively unskilled, and unable to speak English. When I came to this country, I didn't know a word of English, and they put me in class, but thank God for social promotion. As a result, their children often face special challenges in U.S. schools, and we need to produce these, to provide these students not only with skills, which we do need to provide them with, but we also need to prepare them for future U.S. citizenship. And what does that mean? We're going to be discussing Americanization programs, but not the same Americanization programs that we had earlier. But we're not even talking much about that. And as I think several of you pointed out earlier, is that the curriculum has narrowed to math, science, and reading. And again, those are important subjects. But teaching of things such as history of government are not a high priority for us anymore. So our competitive advantage has evaporated. We are still doing well. I'd rather be in this country economically and certainly politically and socially than any other country in the world. But we have a challenge ahead of us, and we'll always have a challenge ahead of us. That's just a normal state of the world. And in this challenge, we need to do something in terms of our education system. It does need some overhaul. Now, so let's take a look at some of the things that seem to have worked. Well, one is Head Start. It's been mentioned several times. It's one of the most innovative and important Great Society efforts to help young disadvantaged children. And it was developed in the mid-1960s during the Johnson administration. One of the things, by the way, we have made big mistakes on. We have read the autobiographies of the founders of Head Start, like Ziegler and others, who have emphasized the role of the Democrats properly. The Democrats are very involved. What we didn't realize, and it's one of the things that the historians have now done, is that actually Ziegler was a latecomer to the idea of Head Start, and the people who were pushing it as part of the anti-poverty world were the Republicans. And that was a historic moment when it was a question of how much money and on whom we should spend it on. And since then, we've made up this myth that there was great hostility to Head Start in the early mid-1960s, which simply wasn't true. The new program, the Head Start, grew rapidly, providing initially 8-week summer program for 500,000 children. But its advocates greatly exaggerated the success of these early Head Start projects. They were well-intentioned, they didn't hurt the kids, but they didn't help them very much either. Initially, the initial Head Start evaluations indicated that early children's academic gains faded. They knew that in 1966. LBJ and others moved immediately to try to correct that situation. They didn't publicize it, but they knew. And they led to programs such as the federal experimental program of follow-through or Head Start plan of variation. So we should be now, I should be telling you, wow, as a historian I have rediscovered these studies and they really show us what to think. Well, I should be able to tell you that because we as taxpayers in constant dollars, today's constant dollars, we spent $3 billion on follow-through. Follow-through was the idea that you take kids from Head Start, you move them into the regular classrooms, and you help them make that transition. Well, this is what we're talking about today. This is what we're funding today. So what did we get for our $3 billion? Well, first of all, most of you have never heard of follow-through. It's a well-kept secret, not only in Madison, but also in Ann Arbor. This program went on for 25 years, from 1967 to 1992. After the first 10 years, they tried to kill the experiment because it wasn't working, and it was poorly run. But Congress kept it going. One of our congressmen from Flint, Michigan, kept it going because he got special money for his district. So one of the questions that we have, seriously, is, can the federal government do serious education research? Because you do need these large-scale type programs. But if follow-through is an example of how to do it, I hope they use your taxes and not mine. Now, despite the large amount, we haven't gotten very much in that sense. The one thing we did get, which we have forgotten, is a Brookings panel on social experimentation in the early 1970s. Their report called for a 5-stage strategy for developing, implementing, and testing new education programs over a 10 to 12-year period. And the idea is, you take something that's promising. Head Start is still promising. And I'm actually a believer in Head Start. And you say, gee, I now think I have a better way of doing Head Start than we've had before. And then you say, yes, I will replicate this pilot program that I'm running in Madison, and I'll try different cities, maybe Milwaukee, maybe Chicago, maybe in a rural area. And if pilots work there, then you say, yes, now I will go to people who are not the experimenters themselves, because they're dedicated, they're doing all these things. I'll try it out in more general population, and then I will develop it. And this was the best thinking of academia at the time. It is still among the best over time. We have forgotten it completely. And when I work in Washington, and even when I'm out of Washington, I have brought this up to almost every administration and said, look, this is how you should do it. This is what you should do. We've never done it. Well, we're still sponsoring sort of kind of looking at things without much rigor, or small experiments. And I'm not against those, but it's no substitute for tackling early childhood education there. Because there is evidence that high quality Head Start does work in terms of both cognitive and social development. But what makes it work? If it's going to be like the Perry preschool, it's going to cost you $12,000, $13,000 per student. Nobody's talking about spending that kind of money. People say, well, Perry preschool showed no cognitive values, and it didn't. But later on, the number of arrests, things like that went down. Well, that's true. But with the Perry preschool people, who are by way of my neighbors in Ypsilanti, Michigan, forget to tell you is that those results work for women, but not for men. They have a small sample to start. And they knew that, by the way, but they really went out of their way never to mention that. Because if you say, yes, it works for women, but not for men, that's a real problem, especially if you're talking about juvenile delinquency and some of these other issues. Also, Ypsilanti is nothing like Detroit today. Growing up in Ypsilanti in 1960 and using that as a model is limited. But you never hear that. This is a problem. It's not that we shouldn't learn from it, but we don't want to replicate a model that is maybe inappropriate for certain parts of our world. All right, so you can see there's a little bit left on Head Start to work on. And I think, by the way, that both the previous Bush administration and Obama have tried to move in this direction. Politically, it is an almost impossible task because the Head Start community, which has been running these programs for all these years, is very resistant to these kind of proposals. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. The program was intended to help disadvantaged kids, and that's really a big, big plus. Now, initially it wasn't. Initially, they were trying to do a categorical program of sending money and then ran into all sorts of political problems, and they couldn't do that. So they came up with the bright idea that if we targeted to economically needy kids, we will be able to get support. The Republicans, by the way, wanted to turn Title I into basically all early childhood education, almost fully funded by the federal government, but then they didn't want to fund the older kids, so their total amount was less. So we set up the program. Robert Kennedy forced the administration to put in the Johnson administration to put in a clause that the program had to be evaluated rigorously, and that's in there. And the program has been evaluated. Unfortunately, not rigorously, and certainly not in the early years. We have not paid much attention to what actually happens to the kids. And what we've done is we've spread the money out so broadly, which is great for political reasons, but not great for helping poor kids. Now, Obama is doing something different. He's trying to say, I'm going to have competitions for money and then get people to sign up, which is a good idea. But politically, it's going to be a bad idea because large parts of the country aren't seeing any of that money. And they're going to say, why should I be voting for that money when I could be voting for this program that will come to my district? So that's a kind of a problem. But Head Start, Title I was small, always less than 10%, but it was one of the few things that said to the country, disadvantaged kids need help, and we should recognize it. They do that better than states have done. Most states do not have much to congratulate themselves in this regard. And ESEA also funded state education staffs, which are very important for this. They provide the research and development monies, and we'll talk about how effectively that's been spent, special education, and improving teacher training, things like that. So ESEA is an important program, but the problem is, for most of its history, we have not really measured seriously what are student outcomes. We've focused more about how we spend the money to make sure that we spend the money equitably. So while money is essential for operating schools, it is not sufficient by itself to ensure high-quality education. Title I really has never done that, and it's been handicapped because politicians in Washington, until very recently, have been unwilling to say, you're not showing much progress in helping disadvantaged kids, so you're going to have to improve. That's not a popular thing to do, and they're already unpopular enough. So that we have not seen much on, and I worry about whether we're even going to see it in the future. There have been attempts under No Child Left Behind, but No Child Left Behind is no different, actually, than Goals 2000 on some of these issues, but it's a question of, is somebody trying to enforce it? So we come to these large education packages. It's a brilliant political move. It starts out with the first Bush, who was the vice president under Reagan, more moderate than Reagan. He wanted to differentiate himself from Reagan, but faced the problem that he can't because he was the vice president. And he suddenly decides during the '88 campaign that he is going to be the education president, which is good because this is a new job for him. He had shown very little interest in education before that. So they start up And it's actually a very complicated story. But the bottom line is, they suddenly decide to change federal approach. Title I was just reauthorized, 1988. Everybody swore up and down that it worked, and it didn't. But that's what they said. All the experts, I'm sure we can find some from every university who said that in 1988 and earlier. And so a lot of people said, why have a new program? If this works, why not just give them more money? Bush said, and it's really Lamar Alexander. Bush didn't really develop it. Lamar Alexander developed it. He said, let's really set up a package, like everybody in Washington. They love packages. And then they have everybody contribute some title to the package. And this package was going to have a series of activities that were drawn together. And we were going to have these 6 national goals, which were negotiated by the nation's governors and Bush. And in 10 years, we were going to reach all these things. So that passed. You know, in principle. When it actually came to the funding of it, America 2000 was not totally funded, especially as they got into school choice issues and other issues. And the 1992 election came up. And nobody wanted to give Bush a head start on the 1992 election, particularly as it looked like initially he was going to win because of foreign policy issues. So Clinton takes over this program, and it's almost the same as America 2000. He calls it Goals 2000. America 2000 had 2,000 communities which pledged to be that. All of the states agreed to have America 2000 packages. Omaha was one of those cities that at least declared itself to be one of these. And then what happens? A large part of this then is a fight between Democrats amongst themselves and Republicans siding on the issue of the question of having specification. Do we need standards for provision of services? And fights begin now to divide the Democrats and Republicans more and more in Congress in these, during the Bush administration and thereafter. So Goals 2000 comes in. Goals 2000 was going to basically be a huge program, and it died a quiet death. No Child Left Behind comes along, and that picks up on Goals 2000. It's very similar, but now Bush 2 says, and we're going to make it work, and we're going to enforce it. And then all of a sudden, we forget this long history. But the basic problem with these, all of these programs, and obviously we're not going to go through them in detail, overly ambitious goals, inadequate funding, incomplete implementation. They're really not even trying to implement them. And ultimately, few, if any, penalties for failing to reach the agreed-upon objectives at the end. They were hastily assembled, loosely related categorical programs. Washington just puts anything they can, and they call it a part of the program. They actually don't alter anything. And there was no attention to how you implement and coordinate education at this scale. And we're still doing it. And I wish I could say, yes, I feel better tonight. I'm going to go to sleep and say, tomorrow will be another day and a better day. I think we're going to repeat. It's just the only question. Obama has already said we're going to be #1 in college attendance. And I would like to bet on that instead of on the basketball game. My odds would be better. So we have actually misled the public and ourselves. And that's the worst part, is ourselves. I can see misleading the public. But ourselves, we have gotten to this idea that everything will be all right. I think Obama made a big mistake of adopting No Child Left Behind, because 2014 is coming up. That'll be your next year's project. You can see where the Bush-Obama plan, how it succeeded in everybody being proficient. Or you may want to skip that. It'd be hard to fund. So throughout these things, we said we want high-quality teachers in schools. We could have had high-quality teachers. We could have written Title I, we could have write No Child Left Behind, and say the money is going disproportionately to places that need high-quality teachers, and the teachers have to be well-experienced and well-trained, and if we need to, we'll pay more for them. But we're not willing to do that, because that means some of that money is not going to go to Ann Arbor, and Ann Arbor does not need that money, but we like it. So the Great Society people assume that better educational opportunities for disadvantaged children would significantly reduce or eliminate poverty. They actually believed in 65, 66, in 10 years on our bicentennial, they really thought we were going to eliminate poverty. I mean, they were out of their minds, but they did. But they put some of these education reforms, and that didn't do it. They didn't put the money into it. The money went into Vietnam. And this is one of the problems. And now the economic inequality in this society is getting worse, not better. So we can't separate out the education system from the larger social structure. I mean, we have to work in each area that we can. But as I said, many people have said today, this is not the way to look at education. Family income differences certainly make a substantial impact on student opportunities and outcomes. We have to look at the structural problems in the society, and we have to have special programs, for example, such as additional summer learning opportunities, but better ones, and a longer school year. And we especially have to help disadvantaged kids. We are not doing that. We just are not doing that. Now, ever since World War II, universities and colleges, as we heard, have tried to attract and educate disadvantaged Americans. We have various acts like the 1958 National Defense Act and 1972 Federal Pell Grant Program. But as we heard this afternoon, disadvantaged kids aren't getting an equal opportunity in education. And some of these studies are embarrassing. You all have seen the study looked at high quality performing students, which is about 4% of the students in the country, but these are really great students. If you come from the upper quartile, 78% of them get into a selective college. Only 34% get into a selective college if you come from the bottom quartile. These are people who probably would just get scholarships. Why aren't they getting in? Because universities aren't trying to get them in. And you know, we have done a good job, not perfect, but we've worked very hard in places like Michigan, and I'm sure places like here, to get minority students in. We have not faced the class issues. I have tried to persuade people in Michigan that we ought to have more outreach to rural areas, to other areas for economically disadvantaged students. No one disagrees with me, but no one ever mentions it again. And this is us. You know, we live in these selective universities. And there are some schools that do better. The well-funded ones now, like Princeton and Harvard, they're actually trying to do better, but they have the money, or used to have the money, to do so. But our public universities are, I'm afraid, letting us down. But finally, let's turn to the issue of education, research, and development. And we all feel good about it. You guys should feel good about it. Probably part of the building was paid for with the overhead money that comes with this activity. And certainly Michigan has done very well with grants at ISR, and we appreciate it. But the question is, what happened to all the money that we spent on research? We already talked about follow-through, but that was only $3 billion. So you say, what's $3 billion among friends? Well, I'll tell you what $3 billion is. $3 billion during the same years is more than we spend all of the money on regional labs and R&D centers. That's a lot of money for us in education. And we stood by. I didn't hear many complaints about follow-through, partly because now nobody remembers follow-through. But we have not done well. So if you look today, for example, at the national, early on, the National Institute of Education, the Office of Education Research and Improvement, where I spent my time, and the current Institute for Education Sciences, they reveal incredible instability and ineffectiveness overall. One of the troubling characteristics of federal education research has been the lack of attention to the quality of funded work. We do not talk about that. They do not. We as academics should be responsible. This is our work. We ought to say, at a minimum, it should be good work. We don't want to talk about it. OERI has done studies in the past, including from the National Academy of Education. They never looked at the quality. Never. So this is really on us. The public's not out there saying, gee, how's random assignments going, or how is case studies going, but with more rigor or something. They don't even understand or care. They're assuming that we are good shepherds of this money, but we have not been. And one of the things that I did when I was in Washington, I sat down, I was brought in to look at the quality of educational research. And Diane Ravitch wanted me to do something very simple. Look at our labs, look at R&D centers, and I was going to do some other things as well, and just ask a simple question. If a scholar just read the material that they produced with the federal money, what would they say? So I picked out 5 of the 10 labs, 8 of the 25 R&D centers, and I asked for them to send me, which they readily did because they're a federal contractor, to send me their work, and I sat there and I read it. And then I asked, as a social scientist and as a humanist, because I'm also that, how good is it? What have we got for it? People don't ask. And the answer is, there were some very good things. Success for all, and there's still issues with that, but that's one of the success stories. That was a good thing that was done by Johns Hopkins. But most of the other projects were supposed to be larger, important things. They weren't. We squandered the money. No one went to Las Vegas with it. But we didn't produce the kind of work that we need today to make the decisions on how to impact on education. Nobody stood up in the universities that I know of to do these things. And so when I worked there for Diane Ravitch, and she basically, I was brought in because of my orientation, and she said, just do a good job, and she never interfered, and was just waiting for me to finish the report. After doing my critique, I would go to the lab or the center, and I could imagine if Adam had gotten a grant, I would sit there and say, gee, that's a very nice study. Let's talk about your methodology a little bit. So everybody had a chance to talk and help me understand these things better. And that was actually very useful. Most people were very honest, and it didn't make me feel any better, but it was useful. So I was drafting the report, and it was getting thick already, and very detailed, and it was public information. I mean, I was just doing it. And then the election came. So people thought I would leave Washington, because I had promised I was going to go back to the history department 2 years later and be chair of the department, which was not the greatest task that was awaiting me. So quietly, but nothing is quiet in Washington if you have friends, the new people came in. First of all, I survived. I was not a political appointee, but I was SES, and that's a nice salary, which is the same thing. But I survived, and either the Clinton people really were foolish, or they were trying to be objective. But the leadership in OERI immediately went to the General Counsel's office in the Department of Education. And they knew I had to go back to Ann Arbor soon, at some point. So they want to know is how could they suppress the report when I left? Now that tells you something about how we do our research in Washington. Now, but having been in Washington, you learn, I had put it in ERIC, as some of you know, it's a depository for things. Once it's in ERIC, there's nothing you can do about it, and there was nothing you could do it anyway. The new people coming in were just like new people. You can't really suppress that. I'm going to take it home, and I'm going to change a couple of words, and I'll let them sue me, and then my book would have sold. It didn't suck. But it's out there. But I have written reports in very distinguished collections where I assess the quality of educational research, and there is good stuff. But then I put in there many of the things that the Department of Education has done in many administrations is really very bad. And I've had close friends come up to me and say, who are the editors, and say, well, Mayor, could you just take that one sentence out? So one of the things I have learned over time, I'll never have to write another essay, is the first draft of an essay I write, I'm nice. I'm always nice in my own mind. But a statement like that is easier to put in on the corrections and additions because people get nervous. But what am I mean, this is, to me, it's a parody. Can you imagine that we in education, who think we're doing great work, allow this to happen? It's us. It isn't somebody else. And as a result, we haven't gotten very far. I'm not very optimistic what we will get out of the research in this administration any more than I am of the previous administration. We have made some progress, but that we have a fascination with randomized field trials in the previous administration, which again I'm for in certain circumstances, but it's not the only thing. And secondly, these are psychological small analyses, valuable, but not a substitute for trying to figure out what works in practice and in a model situation. This administration has, with the stimulus program, you could be working on promising practices, but they didn't have to be that good or that promising, and they certainly wouldn't get the answers. And so I'm dying of curiosity what we're going to see. If you're wondering about what I would do with the situation with cutting back in the Department of Education, which I'd hate to see, the labs would be among my first target. But the labs will be the first to survive. So what can we really do? Let me just summarize. First, we need to remember that states and local communities continue to be the major providers and funders of elementary and secondary education. You in Wisconsin, myself in Michigan, we have a responsibility to our children and to our state, who is spending much of the money on what we do, to do a good job. The National Academy of Education, I think, is actually doing a good job of trying to police ourselves and trying to do a better job. That AERA could use a little more encouragement. And I belong to them, I love them dearly, but they're not being, from my point of view, as rigorous as we should be in that organization. It is a research organization. While the federal government is playing increasingly a role in K-12 education, it is still secondary to anything that the states are doing. So if you're waiting for the federal government to do it, you're going to be disappointed. And one of the reasons is the federal government doesn't have much money. What's our problem? We're living beyond our means. I'm just hoping you guys will keep working so I can retire sometime soon and collect my Social Security. But if you look at our debt level, how can we say there's not a problem? I mean, it's incredible. Clinton, I give him a lot of credit because early in his term, he went against the advice of a lot of his supporters and said, I'm going to work on balancing that budget. And he did. So it can be done. Now, again, it's a long story. I'll be happy to discuss this long story. But we really have to do something about it. We can't keep going like this. So, and do you think we're going to be #1 in the federal government? Healthcare. My knee replacement so I can play tennis. Those are going to be way up there. That when we service the debt, when the interest rates come back up, you will have a shock because we're going to be spending a lot of our money on interest rates. So when we come from education and say, gee, can you keep giving us a little more money because we really are dealing with important things like children, they'll say, you're right, but we don't have it. And then you'll say, well, I'll go back to the States. They did all this all these years. They really did. But I don't get the feeling the States are doing so well. Certainly Michigan isn't doing so well. Detroit is going bankrupt. It's a great tragedy. Detroit in the 1930s was a world-class education institution. I don't know much about Wisconsin, but I do know enough about politics to say good luck. So where are we going to, who's going to pay for all these great ideas that we have? So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to work together. And we're going to have to talk about what can we do at various different levels and who's going to pay for it. And what we can't do is to say, we'll try everything. You know, this idea, well, we'll try everything. Well, first of all, one of the things that history, Michael, does help us is to say, well, yes, we've spent $3 billion on follow-through. Maybe we shouldn't use that particular model. It didn't seem to work. We don't have to reinvent everything. But how do you not reinvent everything if you don't even know it existed? And one of the sad parts I have is every new administration comes in, I usually get a chance to chat with them or that. They're determined to try it all new. And most of the things that we're trying new, we've tried before. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try them again, but we ought to ask, why didn't it work then? What could we do to make it work better? I don't see that attitude. And you might say, well, who needs a historian? I agree with them. But you can't keep spinning your wheels. Other agencies in Washington do much better. NIH is a better research organization than most of the education ones. They have more money, they're more disciplined, the people who work with them get better results. Now they have a lot of problems too, but if I had cancer, I would rather have NIH do the research than some of the things that I would probably think of my own. So one of the problems is the federal government has to play a big role in education research and development. It has to. The states won't do it. They can't do it. And universities don't have the kind of money to do it. Michigan lives on outside federal grants and the overhead they bring in. And as I say, we're very grateful, but we're just not going to be able to do it without that federal help. But our larger problem is, I heard on the previous panel this morning, to talk about politics. And I'm all ready for revolution. I mean, growing up in the 60s and having gone to Selma and all this kind of stuff, it's like reliving my life. But do you really think it's going to happen? I mean, it'll happen, but do you think it's going to have any impact? So you talk about coalitions. And how many of you are out there looking for coalitions beyond yourself and a few like-minded people? And then this is not personal, but every one of us does this. With your luck, the coalition that will get together will be something like the Tea Party people. They're working hard. They have a coalition. Now, are you ready to work with Republicans? Are you ready to work with different people? Most academics don't. So when I've worked with every administration in lots of different things. And for example, when I worked on adolescent pregnancy, and I was working with Planned Parenthood, but Alan Guttmacher in particular, they thought I was a great guy. And my academic colleagues said, boy, oh boy, you're doing good work. I did the same work as a consultant on that topic in the Reagan administration. And the academics said, my God, we tenured this person? Could we have a revote? And they got so nervous about it. At the same time, when I go with, for example, when I worked in the first Bush administration, and then I worked with the Clinton people, my Republican friends, they think, you've lost your mind or your credibility. So we were really not willing to work with other people, or we think they're not willing to work with us. And sometimes they may be right. This may be a time that is very hard. And so I'm not arguing that we should all be bipartisan and try to work hard. Actually, I would like to think some of us will do that. If you think it's more effective to do it the other way, good. I hope it works. And that would be nice. I see politics being divided for the next 10, 15 years. And I thank not the Constitution. This is the one thing you can't blame on the Constitution. The Constitution didn't believe in political parties. The whole Constitution is developed that there would be no political parties. Otherwise, the Electoral College makes no sense. It was a compromise. But so what have we got? We have two political parties which control our districts, the mapping of our districts. Why would anybody allow a political party to do that? You'd have to be out of your mind. But we do that. And so what is the result? General elections don't count. It's primaries. Republicans say, yeah, if I make any compromises, the Tea Party will get me. And they may be right. Democrats who have, in areas where you have the so-called blue dogs, they say the same thing. If I compromise, I'm going to get a primary challenge, and that's my real election, and so you can't work. I don't think you can work in education unless you get bipartisan support. I think education is not only too important for that, it's unrealistic to expect it. And the more divisive we become and continue, the more difficult it'll be for all of us. And the answer is very simple. People are having less children, so less voters have kids at stake in that sense, with the society, but not their kids. More people are sending their kids to private schools. We even send them to Head Start type programs, incredible amount of money. I mean, that's where you should all get a job. But this is wrong. I mean, I believe in public education. We need to make it work, but you're not going to get the support that you want unless we really begin to think through that process of how we attract a coalition and what kind of a coalition. But I think it's going to be so easy for everybody in Wisconsin and Michigan and everywhere to simply read our own magazines, read our own blog sites, pick extremists on both sides, and I'm not saying they shouldn't run, fine, but put them in districts where we as the public have an opportunity for different people. But I don't see anybody jumping at this because they don't want to do it. Now, Electoral College, you say, let's get rid of Electoral College. You'll never get rid of Electoral College. It's just politically impossible. Why? Why would Rhode Island want to give up having 2 senators when Texas has 2 senators? That's what the compromise was all about. So I think we're stuck with the Electoral College. But what if we did break up those electoral districts, like Nebraska does? What if we made Texas competitive? We say all of Texas votes aren't going to go to the winner, they're going to go by districts, and the winner will take some. And most Democrats say, good thinking, Vinovskis, you're really on the ball here. But we need to do the same thing maybe for California. We may need to do the same thing for Ohio, for Michigan. We always answer the question by our immediate needs. Where is that middle that we need? And so those of you who are in education, you may say, okay, there are lots of things you can do, and we've talked about it. But I think you're going to have to come to terms with that as citizens. And as for great hopes for younger people, and I have great hopes for younger people. It's just us old ones that need to go. But they're not voting. I yell at my classes. When I have a survey course in American history, I say, I don't care who you vote for, but for God's sake, vote. I've had students, by the way, chastise me for urging somebody to vote, just in general, which is really interesting. But then we look at the student wards in Ann Arbor. Students aren't voting. So again, as you think through political solutions, and all of this will require political solutions, think about what path you want to take, how you can do it. There are no easy answers. There are no easy answers to education. But I'll end with saying one thing. It's easy to be a critic. One can make a life of it. And it's actually a nice life. You can be a martyr and still live. But you have to really give the past some credit. And one of my favorite people, actually, is Lyndon Johnson. He was obnoxious. He did a lot of bad things, but he cared about the poor. He really cared about the poor. He didn't do it to grandstand. And one of the things that saddens me is when I've had a few chances to testify before Congress, I've said, I really wish that all of you would pay more attention to the poor in your votes and in your activities. I know you have to appeal to the middle class, but surely we could do more. And what people will say to you privately, they say, you're right, but we have elections. So in some ways, the past I want to recapture is the 1960s. We had a lot of things that we did well and a lot of things that we did badly. And the Great Society programs were good and bad. But there was a commitment in that generation to try to make the world better. Most of us stopped making it better. We worry about our lawns. We worry about all these things, now probably student loans. But what we did, many people from that 60s generation did have a commitment to try to do things. We may have disagreed with each other, and we did. And it was a difficult time, but the poor were really very up front. I don't hear many, there isn't enough money among the rich people, especially with their lobbyists. We're not going to see that much more from them. We in the middle class, and I'm middle class, thank God. I mean, given where I come from, this is success. Why shouldn't I give up a second home mortgage, particularly since I don't have a second home? But why shouldn't we cap it at $100,000 or something like that? What sacrifices are we willing to make for the poor? Not in the name of equity, but in the name of what a good society should be. I don't hear us talking like that. I don't hear, you know, both candidates in this last presidential election, I don't remember hearing the word poverty once, except they're talking about their campaign chests. And of course, that wasn't true. Okay, thank you. Oh.
Great. Wow, all I have to do is a little flick of the pinky finger and it ends. Thank you very much. One little comment. I was thinking as you were talking about a thought that comes up sometimes with my students who are new to the study of history. And some of them say, oh, geez, there's so much to do. I don't know if the big problems will ever get solved. And it's just so much. And other people think, whew, at least we don't have to solve everything in the next 2-year election cycle. So two different reactions to understanding more about the past. So let's open it up to question and answer. We have about a little bit more than 15 minutes for Q&A. Michael, would you like to start?
I have a small question. All these big themes that you talked about the last. What? Okay. Thanks. All these big themes you've talked about the last 15 minutes. I feel bad about asking a small question, but you talked about the 1988 reauthorization of Title I.
Yeah.
And you said. I think you said, well, there wasn't research done and they thought it worked. But the sustaining effects study was published in 1984, which was a very large study that came to a variety of mixed conclusions about the efficacy. So my real question is about the politics of what happened to the sustaining effects study such that it was not part of the conversation in 1988.
The wonderful thing about Washington or Madison or Lansing in Michigan is that you don't need a study to take a position. And unfortunately, that's really true. So, and there have been a series of other studies, by the way, which have shown that Title I does not hurt people. It doesn't help the really disadvantaged. And we've had them. Some of those studies during election years or cycles have been temporarily suppressed. And when I was on that panel, you know, on the later times, people didn't use it. So for 1988, scholars knew that Title I was not working, not as well as we thought, actually probably not as anywhere near well enough. It wasn't that we didn't know. But the congressmen who got up and testified, including people who I admire, like Al Shanker, he said it works. And so the question is, and Al Shanker is, by the way, very knowledgeable. I mean, one of the most knowledgeable people I know, unfortunately. He's obviously deceased now. But he's been great for education. He said that. When Bush said, these things don't work, they say, well, that's the Republicans. And there is a part, that's the Republicans. But what is interesting is what Clinton did, which was very important. He said, and he was, remember, one of the governors at that summit. He said, Title I is not working. So when he came to office, he wouldn't allow Title I to be reauthorized in 1994 until Goals 2000 was reauthorized, because his transition team told him, and he also accepted, that Title I wasn't working. And then people all of a sudden say, yes, it isn't working. And then I'd like to sort of look up these quotes from people. Then why did you say this 3 years earlier? Exactly which study were you citing? And I'll give you another example. We have too many examples from Washington. Even Start. People have spent all this money, and people were so excited by Even Start, which is working on parents and the kids together, and this is additional money because you're already probably getting some help somewhere else. And they did a very nice study, just really nice study of this $1 million study that was a good one. And then they went to Congress and they said, yep, I guess it's not, we want to say it's not working. And Goodling, the Republican head of the House committee on that, and his Democratic counterpart said, well, this is actually working. In the hearings, they never mentioned this $1 million study. What they did is what they usually do. They get somebody who says, my child went to Even Start and it made a difference in their lives, and they pat themselves on the back and continued that program. It has been discontinued, by the way. So this is my problem. When we know and we mislead people, shouldn't we feel at least a little bad about it?
Mark?
Yes, thank you. I have a question about kind of answers to this, of course, were included in the talk, but the public perception of crisis in education. So we have Sputnik and the response is NDEA, and there's a broad public response. There's a broad public and political response in '65 and again in the '80s. Well, how is it deteriorated to the point where that's broken today? So we do really badly on PISA in 2009, or we do really badly on the TIMSS tests, and there's almost no public discussion of this.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, some of our classic crises in education, like Sputnik, were over-exaggerated. At the time, Eisenhower said, we are actually moving along, we have secret information, he's flying little planes around, that Soviets aren't very far along, and we shouldn't panic. But the country panics, but also a smart politician takes a panic and translates it into something that they want. And the Democrats, thank God for research, use that as an occasion to pass legislation for further research and education when there was probably no real crisis. So you have to be careful. So in Washington, you're looking for a hook. And you learn, in some ways, the difference between being on the Hill as a staff person. When I was on the Hill, my job was to make the member I worked for look good. And the only success was when the TV cameras were there. We had an incredibly intelligent group of academics working on world population problems. Nobody cared. I mean, we cared. We got 4 teenagers to talk about teenage pregnancy. The cameras were there. They would have promoted us if they could have given us more. So in that sense, people are looking for angles. So today, for example, we have crises. In the name of an economic crisis, we can do things. We don't do them very thoughtfully, usually, in the name of an economic crisis. to get rid of to help disadvantaged kids, you don't wait till it's time to go to college. You ask, why are we spending so much of the Head Start money on middle class or more wealthy people who probably send it anyway, and it would come at a cost. But I'd be willing to pay the money and concentrate on the money on the most poor. First of all, it's going to have the best rates of return, I think, and we're going to do better. So it's this attitude that we need to instill. We spend more money on tax relief for people going to college than we do for helping disadvantaged kids. So my worry is, yes, no one's paying attention to international comparisons, especially, well, I'll watch in the newspaper whether in 2014 you're going to have a conference on No Child Left Behind, son of Bush and Obama. And maybe you can invite them to defend it, or at least somebody from them. I don't think you're going to do that. And this is the problem. It doesn't fit a crisis that people want to push. And that's my problem. So, for example, Obama now is taking a lot more liberties in terms of what he does because he's got a do-nothing Congress. Fine. But I worry about that. If now we have, in 2016, say, somebody's very conservative, those people who say Obama should ignore congressional committees and that on No Child Left Behind, are you going to say, yes, we've set new precedents, we're going to go that way, and we're going to let the new administration, assuming it's a conservative legislation coming out, and say that's fine? No. We're very opportunistic. We like it when they agree with us. We dislike it when they disagree with us. I admire the people who have principles somewhere, not perfect, but somewhat coherent. And that's one of the things I think you should strive for. I think your students should strive for.
Jack?
Thanks. Jack Doherty from Trinity. Maris, you mentioned Diane Ravitch a couple of times, and as I hinted earlier, I'm very curious to hear your interpretation of the reversal she writes in her recent book, The Death and Life of the American School. What surprised you, or what didn't surprise you, since you've known her for a longer period of time?
No, and that's a good question. I knew, first of all, I've read all of her work as a historian, and I think she does very interesting work. I had met her in 3 conferences before she asked me to go to Washington, so I really didn't know her well. My admiration for her really grew in Washington because she was trying to be objective, and so, for example, somebody like Checker Finn was going around saying all labs are bad. And I said, not all. West Ed, at that time, in San Francisco, was a good lab. And, he knows that. But that's not the way you do Washington. So Diane, allowed me to say that. I told her, for example, I was the research advisor to the office, that I was somebody who, I was not wild about school choice. I'm not against it, but I'm not sure it's that practical or that much more. At least it's not a panacea. She didn't say, well, Maris, go back to Ann Arbor. This is not the party line here. In fact, when she introduced me to some people, she said, well, he doesn't agree with all the stuff that we say. So I have a lot of admiration for her. I have a lot of admiration for her writing. So if she changes her mind, fine. Invite me back next year. I'll probably say, gee, I didn't realize everything was going so well. So I don't mind that. But I am, and I'm not surprised, but I am disappointed. When she went 180 degrees. My life is, I don't do that as much, I hope. I always liked Bucky Badger. I still like the mascot, except when we play Wisconsin. She just turned around so absolutely and so totally that that's not my style. And I'm dubious when people do that. And so I haven't actually had a chance to talk to her, just not taking that chance. But I think I would probably come out and say, well, yes, I can see you changing your mind, but I think it's more balanced than that. But there may be something in a style. Maybe when you're in front of audiences all the time and you would try to please them, which obviously I don't, you know, saying, I'm not sure of this, or what about this or that, that doesn't get you an excited audience, depending upon who you go to. I don't know. So that, I'm not surprised because you see some of that, for example, in the debates with revisionists. I happen to disagree with Michael Katz. My book, I would like to think, has disproven what he wrote about Beverly. But I respect him for having done it. I think it's just an academic issue, and we're making progress when I agree or disagree with you. But that's where I feel more comfortable with. The recent thing seems a little more than that, but I may be wrong.
Any other questions? Sarah?
Okay, I've been trying to think about where to start, but I don't know. You're very, very interesting. So I guess I'm trying to figure. I think I am one of those people actually who I would say works in bipartisan circles. I spend a lot of time at the American Enterprise Institute, which confuses folks. And I also happen to work for the What Works Clearinghouse. I'm a contractor for the post-secondary side of things. But I don't think I'm going to actually ask you about your thoughts on where we are right now with What Works. I think actually, and I do want to say, I think what Diane figured out is she had been co-opted and coerced, and she had an awakening. And that's how you get a 180, which is that you realize the blinders come off and you turn around. But I want to actually ask you about what you said about support for public schools and birth rates, because I was trained in a demography program, and I think I understand these things, but okay, so if I look at the numbers, and I want to kind of get a sense of the trends that you're seeing, I actually look at the numbers and see that birth rates among non-Hispanic whites haven't changed over quite a period of time, right? They haven't really changed. Where they've declined is among Latino and Black women. And I'm having a little bit of a hard time thinking about how that would relate to diminished support for public schools, and also that public enrollment is up quite a bit. What I think, and so what we know about those changes, or what we think we know about those changes, is that they're primarily due to a lousy economy. So, you know, birth decisions depend partly on people's thinking that they can handle having a kid. And what we know about poor women's choices to have babies is that they will often think they can have a baby, but getting married requires a whole bunch of additional economic stability that they don't think that they have. That's from Kathy Eden's work. So that our economy is suffering due to changes in tax policies largely. I think it's a created crisis. And college enrollment is rising. So those things could support declining birth rates, but that wouldn't relate to declining support for schools. So do you think it's possible that what we have is omitted variables bias, right, which is what all these randomized trials are designed to get at? And the omitted variable is the political regime change, which tanked the economy, drove down birth rates, and drove down support for schools. Is that a possible omitted variable?
Well, everything is possible, but let me back up and clarify exactly what I meant. At one point, I actually looked at using the national election studies and looked at voters and how many children were in households. And one of the things that was very clear is the number of households with school-age children or coming school-age children over time, and this is actually before all of the recent downturn, is down. So what's happening is there are more and more households who are saying, yes, I believe in education, and I'm willing to pay for education, but I don't have any kids to take care of, and they, elderly particularly, are less likely to vote that way.
Okay, so you just actually said something very different, and I agree with you. I think the number of households with children in them has declined, and that is entirely due to the aging of the population. And what you're telling us is that senior citizens don't support public schools, not that birth rates are declining,
no,
right?
But birth rates over time, sure, overall have a decline. Now, the other thing is they are going to be declining in terms of it looks like, with Hispanics as well, but not necessarily be equal. The other question, though, is how many voters are going to look at this and say, yes, we have a lot of expenses, we have problems, I hope they're going to help me in my old age. I don't feel the same thing for somebody who's other. So what I'm saying is that I think it's much more difficult. And one of the things, by the way, a lot of political scientists have been writing about, well, this support for education, once you pass a threshold, it's always going to be supported. The Republican candidates who were for education are unusual. It's a historical accident. When they leave, they don't leave a mark behind saying, oh yes, I'm for federal education. They now say, oh, that Obama, he's a foreigner himself. So one of the problems that we have is we don't have a constituency for education as much as some of the other published authors think. So all of those things, I think, are going to make it hard. I think we have our work cut out for us. And the second thing is, I don't think we're actually trying to reach all people. I don't think we really are. I hope we are. Because I think you have to work. Now, when I was in Washington, I worked very closely with NEA and the research people there. And I also worked closely with Heritage. And these are different people. At one point, I got them tentatively to agree to have a joint meeting to discuss some of these issues in public. And Heritage was actually kind of enthusiastic. And the NEA people, the research people, thought this was a good idea. And then the NEA people backed out. That to me is sadness. Now, AEI, they try to do more of that, but that's what we need to do. I know liberal opinions because I have a lot of them, and I hear a lot of them at University of Michigan. It's much more interesting to go to a conservative place, but most of us aren't invited.
Alas, we have run out of time, but obviously there's a lot more still to talk about. So we have now a break for dinner, and I think we're back at 7 p.m. in this room for Pauline Littman's talk. So thank you very much.